And good evening, everyone. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. That's right, it's called McDuff Lives. We are at the same place with our channel, but we changed the name. The name was McDuff_2020, but we thought it doesn't quite fit in 2021, so let's change the name. And who's responsible for this name? Well, none other than our great producer engineer, Andy DeBala, who's working the boards tonight. And I wanted to say that the delay tonight was completely my fault, and no, not in any way the fault of our superb engineer and producer, Mr. Andy, who's now considered to be relatively old compared to how old he was when he first arrived here at Mystery Island. So that's
all because of you, John. All because of you.
I know. I mean, he keeps his Browns hat on now because he's losing his. Never mind. I'm not going to give Andy a hard time because he's been working with me, 8-10 hours a day for 7 or 8 days now, and what a terrific guy and a great friend to have made. So tonight, returning to the books, and because it's been a little while, I'll just update you with a little bit of review of Edwin Black's book called War Against the Weak. And this book documents, and it's the subtitle that documents it. It says, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. America's campaign to create a master race. That should be a wake-up call to the importance of this book, because when we read about the Holocaust, we now have the background that comes from the eugenics program. The eugenics program meaning to create a master race, not necessarily that there would be masters and slaves in that sense, but in the sense of a superior race, an improved humanity, a humanity that has eliminated the faults. And so they've set about finding faults with people that they can eliminate. They eliminated blindness. They eliminated feeble-mindedness. They traveled all up and down the Appalachians looking for people who perhaps didn't have great educations, but nevertheless were judged to be feeble-minded because they couldn't answer certain questions that were asked. This type of inhumane treatment of humanity is basically the program of eugenics. So it was not Hitler who began the idea of eugenics. This goes back into the British Empire of the 1800s, where they started realizing that as a small island nation, they were going to have to take some steps to maintain control over their colonies, their dominions, and eventually the rest of the world. So it's that march across the centuries that has involved the creation of a pseudoscience, a fake science, a science that no scientist would approve of. And yet, because it fits in with the desires of these elite banker, industrial, the same names we always run into, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Schiff, Kissinger later, the Dulles brothers, all of the same folks. And now we can look to the World Economic Forum, the Davos billionaires, for the current version of many of these same powerful elite interests behind the scenes, because they don't want the average person to succeed anymore. They want us to either be serfs or to simply go away. And so they've developed all kinds of means of doing it. War was a great one. And then they have developed the other types of weapons, like biological weapons, chemical weapons. This, what they call the negative eugenics, is a euphemism for genocide. Well, let's read now some, because I think it's very important that we follow through this theme of America's role. And America's role comes through people like John D. Rockefeller II or Jr., Andrew Carnegie, the Ford Foundation, and others of these pseudo-philanthropic organizations that end up really funding the demise of the common person instead of working to help common people survive and overcome their difficulties. So, well, you know what I'm saying. That is that this Rockefeller and Hitler are not all that different in their philosophies. In fact, we find evidence in this book of common purpose, common work, and a desire to try things such as genocide. So we were discussing the Eugenical Congress, the Third International Congress of Eugenics in New York City in August of 1932 at the American Museum of Natural History, one of the great iconic buildings of New York City. And you know, you've probably visited it, maybe even on a school trip. Well, read about what they did with the natives of the Arctic Circle when they brought some back, and you know, they became exhibits. It's a tribute to that same mindset that we are the elite, we are the vanguard of humanity, and there are all these lesser humans around that we're going to have to either manage or get rid of. Overpopulation. So they had the Third International Congress in 1932. Although organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation were donating vast sums to German eugenics for research and travel, the grants were frequently limited to activities within Germany or neighboring countries. The September to October Eugenical News carried a long article praising Hitler and his eugenic ideas. It also explained how his ideology had been guided by such American authors as Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. German elections were looming, and the article prophesied the results. Quote, "The Hitler movement sooner or later promises to give him full power and will bring to the Nordic movement general recognition and promotion by the state." The article added, "When they, the Nazis, take over the government in Germany, in a short time, there may be expected new race hygienic laws and a conscious Nordic culture and foreign policy." The next month, in November of 1932, Germany held a fractious election. Hitler received 12 million votes, approximately a third, but no majority. On January 30th of 1933, as America awoke, swastikas flew above Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, and other strongholds of Nazi agitation. Brown-shirted mobs marched through the streets in celebration, swaggered in beer halls, rode their bicycles in tandem, and joyously sang the Horst Wessel song. For years, the Nazis had promised that upon assuming power, they would rebuild Germany's economy, dismantle its democracy, destroy the German Jewish community, and establish Aryans as the master race. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, exasperated with fruitless all-night attempts to create a governing coalition, finally exercised his emergency powers. Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler interim chancellor. The Third Reich was born. Years later, many would deny knowledge of what Germany was doing, would claim they only discovered Hitler's merciless anti-Semitic and political repression, as well as the Reich's fascist medical programs, after the Allies triumphed in 1945. But in truth, Hitler's atrocities against Jews and others were chronicled daily on the pages of America's newspapers, by wire services, radio broadcasts, weekly newsreels, and national magazines. Germany bragged about its anti-Jewish measures and eugenic accomplishments. An entire propaganda operation was established under Joseph Goebbels to publicize the information. Simultaneously, American eugenicists kept day-to-day tabs on the Nazi eugenic program. As of January 30th, 1933, however, the American-German eugenic partnership was obsolete. Germany was now completely leading the way, despite a hurricane of anti-Nazi denunciations and retaliatory economic boycotts. Once in power, Hitler's government immediately began issuing legal decrees to exclude Jews from professional and government life and used other brutal methods, including condoned street violence, to eliminate political opponents. Dachau concentration camp opened on March 20th, 1933, and amid international news coverage of the event, refugees, including many Jewish scientists, poured out of Germany. Their plight was visible in the cities of the world. It did not take Germany long to implement its eugenic vision. The first law was decreed on July 14, 1933, Reichsstatute Number 1, Part 86, the Law for the Prevention of Defective Progeny. It was a mass compulsory sterilization law. Rudin was co-editor of the official rules and commentary on the law. 9 categories of defectives were identified for sterilization. At the top of the list were the feeble-minded, followed by those afflicted by schizophrenia, manic depression, Huntington's chorea, epilepsy, hereditary body deformities, deafness, and of course, hereditary blindness. Alcoholism, the 9th category, was listed as optional to avoid confusion with ordinary drunkenness. The Reich announced that 400,000 Germans would immediately be subjected to the procedure beginning January 1st, 1934. A massive sterilization apparatus was created. More than 205 local eugenic or hereditary courts would be ruled by a physician, a eugenicist, and a chairman. For contested cases, there were at least 26 special eugenic appellate courts. Anyone could be reported for investigation. Doctors who failed to report their suspect patients would be fined. In hearings, physicians were obliged to provide confidential patient information. Fisher's Institute was asked to quickly train the legion of race experts required for the task. Germany's program was immediately seized upon by the world's media as the latest example of Hitler's inhumane regime. Many eugenic leaders felt pressures into publicity, into publicly disassociating themselves with Nazi barbarism, but their denunciations were only lip service. An anxious C.P. Blacker, director of Britain's Eugenics Society, watched as his own sterilization campaign lost public support as the obvious comparisons were made. This society deprecates the use of the term eugenics to justify racial animosities, Blacker announced, adding that he condemned its misuse as an instrument of tyranny by racial or social majorities. While much of the world recoiled in revulsion, American eugenicists covered eugenic developments in Germany with pride and excitement. By the summer of 1933, eugenical news had become bi-monthly due to Depression-era finances, and it changed its subtitle again, this time to Current Record of Genetic News and Race Hygiene. Cold Spring Harbor quickly obtained a full copy of the 18-paragraph Nazi sterilization law from German consul Otto Kiep, and rushed a verbatim translation into the next issue as its lead item. In accompanying commentary, Eugenical News declared, quote, Germany is the first of the world's major nations to enact a modern eugenical sterilization law for the nation as a unit. The law recently promulgated by the Nazi government marks several substantial advances. Doubtless, the legislative and court history of the experimental sterilization laws in 27 states of the American Union provided the experience, which Germany used in writing her new national sterilization statute. When versed in the history of eugenical sterilization in America, the text of the German statute reads almost like the American model sterilization law. Proudly pointing out the American origins of the Nazi statute, the article continued, quote, "In the meantime, it is announced that the Reich will secure data on prospective sterilization cases, that it will, in fact, in accordance with the American model sterilization law, work out a census of its socially inadequate human stock." Countering criticism that Hitler's program constituted a massive human rights abuse, Eugenical News asserted, to one acquainted with English and American law, it is difficult to see how the new German sterilization law could, as some have suggested, be deflected from its purely eugenical purpose and be made an instrument of tyranny, unquote, for the sterilization of non-Nordic races. The publication argued that in the 16,000 sterilizations performed in America over recent years, not a single eugenical mistake had been made. The publication concluded, one may condemn the Nazi policy generally, but specifically it remained for Germany in 1933 to lead the great nations of the world in the recognition of the biological foundations of national character. Pardon me a second. The biological foundations of national character. Can you imagine the interesting thing, thinking about nature and how, say, birds learn how to fly, thousands of miles to the same place every season, or how animals pass on knowledge to their young. And you think, well, yeah, there's probably some actual genetic material of some kind that's been created that helps animals generation after generation to understand that you have to avoid, perhaps you have to avoid humans, or you have to avoid, animals that are bigger than you are, or perhaps ones with those bright colors that are poisonous. And if you learn these things, you can't explain the understanding of animals that are just maybe 1 or 2, 3 years old without thinking that this has been passed on somehow through their genes. On the other hand, the idea that a nation within a couple of years or decades could create a biological change in the humans that live in that nation and create a biological character of a nation is absurd. It's beyond absurd. It's crazy. But this is part of the whole pseudoscience of eugenics, that it is from the beginning, it doesn't make any sense. And yet, because it pleases the bankers, the industrialists, the elites, the racists at the top that can pay for it, the program went on and on and on. Rockefeller money continued to stream across the Atlantic. The 1933 financial books of the Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics reflected the foundation's continuing impact. Page 4 of the balance sheet, Rockefeller paid for a research assistant, a statistician, 2 secretaries, and a gardener. Page 6 of the balance sheet, Rockefeller paid clerical costs associated with research on twins. Ironically, while Fisher remained in charge at the Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, he was being replaced at the Society for Racial Hygiene. He had taken over the Society for Pletz, but in 1933, Nazis overran the society and Fisher was considered too moderate. He was replaced by Rudin, then the president of the IFEO. Unlike eugenic leaders associated with eugenical news, Rockefeller officials did not propagandize for Nazism, nor did they approve of the Reich's virulent repression. The Rockefeller Foundation's agenda was strictly biological, to the exclusion of politics. The foundation wanted to discover the carriers of defective blood, even if it meant funding Nazi-controlled institutions. Moreover, Rockefeller executives knew their money carried power, and they used it to ensure that the most talented scientists continued at the various Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, frequently shielding them from periodic Nazi purges. For example, in early June 1933, one of the Foundation's favorite researchers, Oskar Vogt, head of the Institute for Brain Research, was threatened with removal because of his perceived socialist leanings. Rockefeller mobilized. On June 7, 1933, H.J. Muller, a University of Texas geneticist working at the Institute for Brain Research, alerted Robert A. Lambert in Rockefeller's Paris office. Just days before, Lambert had toured various Berlin research facilities. In his letter, Muller warned Lambert, if this director loses his position, it is a foregone conclusion and common knowledge that the head of the genetics department and all other non-Germans, as well as Germans closely associated with the director, will also lose their positions. I realize that the Rockefeller Foundation must preserve its neutrality so far as matters of politics are concerned. On the other hand, it wishes to have its funds used so that they can best serve the furtherance of truly scientific work. The name Muller here, M-U-L-L-E-R, is very likely related to M-U with the umlaut, L-L-E-R. Often that umlaut might be dropped in someone who comes to America and lives in Texas. So a relation to the Muellers and Mullers that we often speak of is not out of the question for H.J. Muller of the University of Texas Institute for Brain Research. Muller asked Lambert and other Rockefeller executives to consider, quote, the making of a statement, not necessarily a public one, but it may be one expressed in a letter to some responsible person, such as, for example, the physicist Dr. Max Planck, who could then be shown to the authorities concerned so that they could be informed of your policy in advance. Some statement similar to that which you made orally to the director of the institute here would suffice, namely, that the Rockefeller Foundation would not feel justified from the point of view of the furtherance of scientific work in sending additional funds to the support of institutions in Germany, one, if, on grounds other than scientific work, worthy scientists not engaged in political activity are dismissed from institutions which have been founded or supported in part by funds of the foundation, or, two, if persons who have been assigned stipends from the foundation are dismissed from such institutions. Oskar Vogt was not removed. He remained at his post until well after his Rockefeller funding had run its course. With each passing day, the world was flooded with more Jewish refugees, more noisy anti-Nazi boycotts and protest marches against any scientific or commercial exchanges with Germany, more public demands to isolate the Reich, and more shocking headlines documenting Nazi atrocities and anti-Jewish legislation. Still, none of this gave pause to America's eugenicists. Correspondence on joint research flowed freely across the Atlantic. American eugenicists and their many organizations and committees, from New York to California and all points in between, maintained and multiplied their contacts with every echelon of official and semi-official German eugenics. As the Reich descended into greater depths of depraved mistreatment and impoverishment of Jews, as well as territorial threats against its neighbors, these contacts seemed all the more insulated from the human tragedy unfolding within Europe. Eager and cooperative letters, reports, telegrams, and memoranda did not number in the hundreds, but in the thousands of pages per month. While concentration camps pauperization and repression flourished in Nazi Germany, and while refugees filled ships and trains, telling horrifying stories of torture and inhumanity, it was business as usual for eugenics. Nor were the contacts and scientific support a secret. For example, in March of 1934, eugenicist W. W. Peter published a long article in the American Journal of Public Health defending Germany's sterilization program. Peter had traveled some 10,000 kilometers over the course of 6 months, visiting every region of Germany to study the Reich's plan. He gave it an unqualified endorsement, declaring, quote, "This particular program which Germany has launched merits the attention of all public health workers in other countries," unquote. I'm going to stop and make one of my points that occur to me sometimes. I call them speed bumps when I read something and I say, I gotta say this. This particular program which Germany has launched merits the attention of all public health workers. Public health workers. Think of the irony of promoting to a public health worker the idea of eugenics. It's completely backwards, because we respect our public health workers as people will do anything to help the sick, the infirm, the weak, the elderly, those that are unable to care for themselves. That's what we think of as our public health workers. This is the difference between American citizens with individual rights and National Socialism, where it's not the rights of the individual, but the rights of the nation that are considered by government. So that when they say public health, they mean eugenical health. They mean biologically superior humans in the population, so that the idea of sterilization, the idea of euthanasia, the idea of not caring for the sick, of not caring for the elderly and letting them die, fits within their agenda. So when we see people in this country acting to let the old people die, acting to not take care of the sick, acting as if they were the guardians of, quote, public health, we know that they have turned away from the Constitution. They've turned away from the American dream and into the dark side of humanity, eugenics, Nazism, National Socialism. In mid-July of 1934, the IFEO met in Zurich and congratulated Germany on a campaign being conducted, quote, with characteristic thoroughness and efficiency, mainly on sound and truly eugenic lines. That conclusion was publicized in eugenical news. The idea was to rebut mounting criticism that the Reich's mass sterilization program was not only a medical sham, but undisguised racial persecution. In Germany, racial persecution invariably meant Jewish persecution. Newspapers around the world were filled with condemnation of Germany and of its treatment of the Jews. Jews were indeed on the minds of the eugenicists at Cold Spring Harbor. For example, the New York Times of January 7, 1934 had run an article on Hitler's race policy headlined, quote, "Nazis insist Reich be race-minded," and subheadlined, "No one knows exactly what that means there except that Jews are the target." The article went into Loughlin's clipping folder. So did other New York Times articles from January and early February about German Jewish refugees in Europe, as did articles about financial assistance to Jews in the United States. The folder grew thick. With so much anti-Nazi publicity in the air, putting a positive face on the Reich's conduct was a continuing priority at eugenical news. even as the New York Times was denigrating the Reich's eugenics as pure racial and religious oppression and using quotes from Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick to illustrate the point. Loughlin was assuring colleagues that the Cold Spring Harbor publication would help counteract that impression among eugenicists. Loughlin's January 13, 1934 letter to Madison Grant explained, "We propose devoting an early number of the eugenical news entirely to Germany and to make Dr. Frick's paper the leading article. Dr. Frick's address sounds exactly as though spoken by a perfectly good American eugenicist in reference to, quote, what ought to be done. With this difference that Dr. Frick, instead of being a mere scientist, is a powerful Reichsminister in a dictatorial government which is getting things done in a nation of 60 million people." Dr. Frick's speech marks a milepost in statesmanship. The new German attitude and resolution mean that in the future, regardless of nationality, every statesman who takes the long view of his country's problems will be compelled to look primarily to eugenics for their solution. It's an eerie word, solution, is it not? Pardon me. In the very next issue, March-April 1934, the speech in question, delivered by Frick 9 months earlier, led off an edition devoted to German eugenics. It included a detailed directory of the Third Reich's leading eugenics, exuberant praise of the Nazi sterilization campaign, and one article describing the flood of Jewish refugees with the phrase, quote, "It's raining German Jews." Another article examined the destinations of some 60,000 German Jewish refugees. 25,000 had fled to France, 6,500 to Palestine, 6,000 to Poland, and so on. There was room in the issue to discuss other minorities as well. One article discussed the question of sterilizing some 600, quote, Negroid children in the Rhine and Ruhr districts, Germany's legacy from the presence of French colonial troops there during the war, unquote. In a salute to the Führer, another article clearly suggested that Hitler's eugenics would soon be applied across all of Europe. But this state cause does not only concern Germany, but all European peoples. But may we be the first to thank this one man, Adolf Hitler, and to follow him on the way towards a biological salvation of humanity. Eugenical News was the official voice of the American eugenics movement. Its masthead declared it, quote, the official organ of the Eugenics Research Association, the Galton Society, the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations, and the Third International Congress of Eugenics. It was published at the Carnegie offices in Cold Spring Harbor. A 3-man editorial committee listed on every masthead tightly controlled all text: Harry Loughlin, Charles Davenport, and Morris Stegerda, Davenport's assistant on the Jamaica project. Eugenical News was read by virtually the entire eugenics community in America and enjoyed an equally attentive overseas readership. In Nazi Germany, race hygienicists followed the publication closely. After the March 1934 issue, for example, Plutz wrote a letter to the editor correcting several typos and adding a clarification, quote, the 60,000 Jews were not expelled. Nobody chased them away. They went, frightened by the Jewish reports of horror. Ironically, in the same issue, Eugenical News ran a report headlined Jewish Physicians in Berlin that declared, the city of Berlin, quite logically, is trying to reduce the number of its Jewish physicians, which is not in keeping with the racial composition of the general population. The article added that anti-Jewish laws were still not working and the numbers of Jewish doctors were but slightly reduced. Pardon me. Rockefeller funding continued even as anti-Nazi protest groups complained directly to Foundation executives. For example, shortly after Hitler attained power, Rudin and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes became known as mere scientific fronts for Nazi ideology. The Foundation's own best contact within Rudin's institute, Dr. Walter Spielmeyer, confirmed in a November 3, 1933 letter, Professor Rudin also holds the post of Reichskommissar for Race Investigation. One word surfaced in late 1933 of the Foundation's ties to Rudin and his Munich-based Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry. The anti-Nazi boycotters and protest movements mobilized. One typical complaint letter from New Republic editor Bruce Blyven to the Rockefeller Foundation, sent December 20th, 1933, asked whether the reported link could be true. Concerned officials at the Foundation jotted notes on Blyven's letter. June 1st, 1932, $9,000, 3 for 3 years. Under that, someone wrote, Institute for Anthro. Under that, Sexuality and Genetics. On January 10, 1934, Rockefeller executive Thomas Applegate replied to Blyven that the Foundation had indeed helped erect the building some years before and had then approved another 8-year grant for 2 of its doctors. But, Applegate added, quote, strictly speaking, Rudin's Institute is not an institute of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft. A Rockefeller colleague who saw this falsity scribbled in the margin, TBA, what basis for this? On January 31st, Applegate wrote to Blyven in correction of my earlier communication and admitted that the Institute for Psychiatry was indeed one of the regular institutes. Protests did not subside. 2 days later, Jewish newspapers across the country published notices similar to the one that appeared in the American Hebrew. Quote, recently, the American Committee Against Fascist Oppression in Germany declared that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, a German institute for psychiatric research with headquarters in Munich and subsidized by the Rockefeller Foundation, is carrying on a bitter pro-Nazi agitation. The committee accuses the institute of spreading Nazi propaganda under the cloak of science and paid for by the money of the Rockefeller Foundation. One of the institute's departments, devoted to the study of racial theories, has, quote, proved through, quote, scientific claims that Hitler's theory regarding the superiority of the Nordic race and the inferiority of the Semitic and other races is altogether correct. Dr. Theodor Lang, founder of the National Socialist Doctors Association, is also a research worker of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. His Doctors Association is carrying on a bitter campaign against Jewish physicians in Germany, unquote. The Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America continued the pressure, sending the Foundation the, quote, American Hebrew article and asking for an explanation. Worried Rockefeller officials sent a note to a Foundation attorney explaining, quote, as a matter of fact, it is not research that would lend itself to propaganda purpose. Rudin was and continues to be a member of the staff of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry. No grants have ever been made for his work or for the general budget of the Institute. Rudin's political affiliations are not under the control of the Institute or the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft. Undoubtedly, some of the anti-Semitic publications which your correspondent describes have been written in the building that we donated. In the circumstances, I think it quite untrue to say that the Foundation funds are being used to subsidize race prejudice. Yet the protest letters still flowed in. Quote, we are getting a number of inquiries from various liberal groups as to our connection with the Forschungsanstalt für Psychiatrie, the Research Institute for Psychiatry in Munich. The principal complaint is that Professor Rudin is apparently very active in the preparation of the anti-Jewish propaganda. Rockefeller officials tried to provide assurances to protesters that they were not funding Rudin himself, but rather two doctors working under his direction. But this hardly believable story was itself internally contradicted. A March 1934 letter to Applegate by the Foundation's Paris representative reminded, quote, "There is, however, another grant of funds made through the Notgemeinschaft der Deutschen Wissenschaft, that is the Emergency Fund for German Science, which at least in part is utilized by Professor Rudin, $125,000 over a period of 5 years. That sum equals more than $1 million in 21st century money." Despite anti-Nazi protests, Rockefeller continued its subventions to Germany. Indeed, the foundation made periodic increases to account for the fluctuating exchange rate. Moreover, it quickly learned that while its grants specified that money go to one project, Nazi science administrators were quite willing to divert it to another department with a greater ideological priority. For example, in October of 1934, Alan Gregg, director of the Foundation's Division of Medical Sciences, received a blunt letter from the Foundation's most reliable contact in Rudin's institute, Dr. Spielmeyer. Quote, "In the field of medicine," Spielmeyer unhappily conceded, "both practice and scientific research is concerned primarily with genetics and race hygiene, as you know. You convinced yourself of that this summer during your visit." He went on to explain that the space and resources that the Foundation financed for his blood chemistry research had been appropriated by Rudin's race investigations. Rudin reported Spielmeyer simply required more space, more stenographers, and more race investigators. For this reason, it was unfortunately not possible to maintain the chemical division properly. The Rockefeller Foundation has, for the past 4 years, provided funds for the maintenance of the chemical division, said Spielmeyer, but those funds were now being used for, quote, racial research. Well, that brings us up to 9 o'clock and the end of our hour. I do apologize for the late start tonight, but again, I'm just thrilled with the new studio space. I'm thrilled with the lighting, the camera work, the production. Andy is adding graphics as I do my readings now, and I'm just walking on air. It's a fantastic feeling, and I'm very grateful to everyone. All of you who are in the chat room, I hope you have a great evening. Thanks for being here with us tonight on Macduff Lives.